we're into the Alpha Geek IPA.
Yes.
So
Alpha Geek.
I'm sure there's a whole heap of IPA fans out there that are going to be very curious about this beer. So how did you approach it when you were designing the recipe?
Yeah, well, this beer originally was called the Flower Arranger, obviously because a lot of flowers were arranged in the making hop flowers. That was so. But yeah, so the Flower Arranger was originally brewed for the West Coast IPA Challenge here in Wellington at the Malt House, and I can't recall it. Either might have picked up a silver or a bronze. It got the silver or bronze the year, whatever year it was that it was originally brewed anyway, and the idea with this originally was to use sort of 7 American hop varieties and play with them as such to get a really good IPA, American style IPA. And I did it that way, again, because of these variations. In New Zealand, we don't get, particularly as a small brewer, I don't really get to batch select my hops. In previous breweries, I've actually had the luck of being able to, or the advantage of being able to do that. So when you're getting your year's supply of Simcoe or Citra or Mosaic or Centennial all at once, you're kind of hoping that the profile will be very similar than it was for the year before. I tend not to do so many single hop beers because I want to ensure that I get consistency and that when someone tastes the beer, they know it's Alpha Geek. If I of my 41 beers on tap do a blind tasting, I mean, obviously I'm going to know that it's Alpha Geek anyway, but I want to be able to do that this year and next year and still, without tasting in between in theory, and still know it's that beer. So it means that you end up, I guess it's experience. You end up knowing hops really well and knowing how they work together, and also knowing how they present in beers in certain ways, whether it be adding them in Whirlpool or at Flame Out or at Dry Hop. So this beer kind of came about with not knowing what my hops are going to be like year on year. Is where does that sound? But the end result being that I wanted a beer that tasted great and tasted like it was always the Flower Ranger, always Alpha Geek. So I think the recipe is actually, when I was writing this recipe out for you guys, I went, I'll look back on the last sort of 10 batches, and the hop additions, particularly at Flame Out and at Dry Hop, are always slightly different. So I kind of had to mash a recipe together, the best of all of those sort of worlds. So I usually write little tasting notes on every batch for this recipe. But this is very similar, this recipe, to the one that's in bottle as well. And it's working on mainly with Amarillos and Centennials and Citras. I think the Dry Hop, we've got some Simcoe in there as well. But all of those classic American hops, you could probably, do 1,000 different combinations and just playing around and tweaking. But I'd probably be able to taste your homebrew and know that it was an Alpha Geek clone, because it's it's just, I don't know, using golden naked oats in it as well, I think gives it a little bit of a sort of a character that you don't often get in other IPAs, and I'm a big fan of that sort of lovely, almost berry-like sort of, toasty kind of granola-y sort of character that those oats give is just phenomenal. And theoretically, and I've sort of read a bit into this, it's they actually help with oxidation as well. The more oats you use, in theory, the less oxidation you're going to get. So that's a pretty cool little thing that's been sort of found out, particularly with people trialing things like leading into 100% oat malt beers and that sort of stuff. But that's something that people can jump onto the internet and read lots about, because it's interesting stuff.
Well, we've got over 200 grams dry hopping in the 23-litre batch. So the homebrewers are obviously going to want to do everything they can to make sure that they're minimizing oxidation and losing that hop aroma, I guess.
Yeah. And I'd say my suggestion would be, if you're worried about that, don't be afraid to chuck it in when it's at sort of 10, 20 or something like that. It's or even a little bit higher. It's it'll work its magic. There's enough residual sort of like body and intensity, but anything over 6%, my theory is you kind of not going to get as much impact with leaving it on dry hops for longer. You've got the joys of that alcohol sweetness and the body, the glycerol that the yeast are producing, all these sorts of things that are going to kind of temper and potentially even boost drinkability. So I know my theory is that sort of 6% and up, your hop derived astringency, particularly cold side or during ferment, is a lot less than when below 6% alcohol beers. So so don't be afraid. if you can aseptically mix it, chuck a bit of CO2 on top and give it a mix with a solid spoon once you dry hopped it. If you're in a bucket or something, do that. You want to maximize that sort of surface area, particularly when you're heading towards the 8-9 gram per liter, which is probably about the maximum you're going to be in terms of hop solubilization before you hit those sort of laws of diminishing returns and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, make the most of them.
What's your stand on the Whirlpool edition? I think looking at this, you don't get a huge amount of bitterness from your boil edition, which seems to be just not even 10 IBUs. And then you have a massive steep hop edition, which seems to be about 85 grams for 23 liters. So that comes down to what, 4 grams a liter roughly. Do you have a kind of a feel on what grams per liter you usually do on IPAs in the Whirlpool edition, or do you just go purely based on the bitterness contribution?
Usually I look at bitterness. So it all kind of depends. Really it's every beer is just like, so different when I do it. But if I'm doing a very low, I've sort of did a lot of, I sort of emailed about this stuff called regression analysis that we've done at Thornbridge, looking at hop utilization based on what the initial amount of bitterness you were getting from those sort of bittering additions was. And we kind of found that obviously if you're loading up the front end, you get a lot less bitterness in the back end. But this year, I always, for most beers here, I'll usually just only go for about probably maximum sort of 15 bitterness units in the initial edition, and try and get the rest of my bitterness from those flame out or Whirlpool editions. But I want those oils. And again, if you try exit strategy next to Alpha Geek, you'll actually get, the texture, even though there's only 1.2% difference. In terms of the dry hop, it's quite similar. But in terms of that sort of hop flavor that you get from those Whirlpool or flame out editions, it's just so different. It's such a different sort of like, it almost gives this sort of richness of hop in the mouth that you don't get if you've loaded up just the front end alone and relied on dry hop to give you that hop sort of like aroma. But yeah, beers like IPAs, particularly American style IPAs, you can really go hard on the hot side or those sort of just sub 100 degrees Celsius editions and get some pretty good kind of like sort of flavor results as opposed to aroma results. So that's why I kind of like doing that with my IPAs. And all my IPAs will do the same. I'll always be looking for, depending on the alpha acid, probably between 2 and maybe 6 grams per liter as my Whirlpool edition. And that helps to get that sort of like, I guess, hop structure on the palate as well.